The rain hammered the cheap wooden casket, and the preacher sighed at the rows of empty folding chairs. A decorated war hero was about to be buried with no family, no friends, no tears. Then the ground began to tremble. A thunderous roar of engines shattered the silence, and everything changed. The sky over Oak Haven, Ohio, was the color of bruised iron. A cold, relentless drizzle fell over Pine Ridge Cemetery, slicking the grass and turning the freshly dug earth into a dark, uninviting mire. Reverend Thomas Miller stood under a large black umbrella, his knuckles white as he gripped the wooden handle. He stared at the casket resting on the lowering device. It was a simple, unfinished pine box, the absolute cheapest option the state provided when a man died with nothing and no one. Draped over the cheap pine, however, was an American flag. It was the only splash of vibrant color in the dreary grayscale afternoon. The man inside the box was Arthur Callahan. To the town of Oak Haven, Arthur was just the crazy old hermit who lived in a rusted-out Airstream trailer on the edge of the county line. He was the man who walked with a severe limp, bought his groceries at 6 a.m. to avoid people, and paid for his canned beans and instant coffee with exact change. He never spoke, never made eye contact, and never asked for help. 2 days ago, the local sheriff's deputy, a young kid named Bradley, had found Arthur dead in his armchair, a half-empty mug of coffee gone cold on the side table. He had passed away quietly in his sleep at the age of 74. Thomas looked up from the casket and scanned the burial site. Set up on the wet grass were 20 metal folding chairs, meticulously arranged by the funeral home director. Every single one of them was empty. Thomas felt a heavy, suffocating knot form in his throat. It wasn't just the sheer loneliness of the scene that broke his heart. It was the profound disrespect. When the county coroner had cleaned out Arthur's Airstream, they found a beat-up, water-damaged shoebox hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside that box wasn't money or letters from a lost love. It was a collection of military commendations, a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and nestled in a velvet case that had lost its fuzz decades ago, a Silver Star. Arthur Callahan had been a sergeant in the 1st Cavalry Division during the Vietnam War. He had bled for his country in the jungles of the Ia Drang Valley. Yet here he was, returning to the earth with absolutely no fanfare. "Should we just get on with it, Reverend?" a raspy voice asked. Thomas turned to see Bill, the cemetery's veteran gravedigger, leaning against a yellow backhoe a few yards away. Bill was smoking a soggy cigarette, looking miserable in the freezing rain. "We wait the full 15 minutes, Bill," Thomas said, his voice tight. "It's a matter of respect." "Respect doesn't keep the rain off, Tom," Bill muttered, pulling his collar up. "Nobody's coming. You know it." "I know it. Hell, even his own blood didn't want to stick around." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering the brief, infuriating encounter at the funeral home that morning. Arthur did have one living relative, a niece named Brenda, who lived 3 hours away in Cleveland. When the sheriff tracked her down, Brenda drove down to Oak Haven with impressive speed. But she hadn't come to mourn. She had come with a lawyer, demanding to see the will and the deed to Arthur's property. When Thomas had gently informed her that Arthur didn't own the land his trailer sat on, and that his bank account held a meager $400, Brenda's face had hardened into a mask of disgust. $400? That won't even cover the gas I spent driving down here, Brenda had scoffed, grabbing her designer purse. "Bury him. Cremate him. I don't care. I'm not standing in the mud for an old lunatic who couldn't be bothered to send a Christmas card for 30 years. She had marched out of the funeral home, her high heels clicking sharply against the linoleum, leaving Thomas alone with the stark reality of Arthur's isolated existence. Thomas looked at his watch. 2014 p.m. The scheduled start time was 2000 p.m. He had called the local VFW post begging for an honor guard, or at least a butler to play taps. The post commander, Richard, had been sympathetic but unhelpful. "Half my guys are down with the flu, Reverend, and the other half are too old to stand in a freezing downpour. I'm sorry, we'll drink a beer for him tonight." So it was just Thomas and a gravedigger. "All right, Bill," Thomas finally conceded. Stepping closer to the grave, he opened his leather-bound Bible, the pages instantly curling from the damp air. "Let us begin." Thomas cleared his throat, projecting his voice over the steady drumbeat of the rain hitting the umbrella. "We gather here today, in the presence of God, to commit the soul of Arthur James Callahan to eternal rest." Arthur was a man of quiet. Thomas paused, struggling to find the words. How do you eulogize a ghost? Quiet dignity. He served his country with valor and distinction. He faced horrors we cannot imagine, so that we might live in peace. He looked at the empty chairs again. A wave of bitter anger washed over him. The world had taken everything from Arthur Callahan: his youth, his health, his peace of mind. And in return, it couldn't even offer him a handful of mourners to witness his departure. "The Lord is my shepherd," Thomas read aloud, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." As Thomas read the ancient words of Psalm 23, a strange sensation washed over him. He stopped reading. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, a low rhythmic vibration coming through the soles of his dress shoes. The muddy water pooled in the footprints around the grave began to ripple. Bill dropped his cigarette, stepping away from the backhoe. "You feel that, Reverend?" Thomas frowned, looking toward the rolling hills that bordered the eastern edge of Pine Ridge Cemetery. The vibration was growing stronger, traveling through the earth like a localized earthquake. Then the sound caught up to the feeling. It was a deep, guttural rumble, like a fleet of heavy bombers flying dangerously low over the treetops. "Is that thunder?" Bill asked, shielding his eyes from the rain. "No," Thomas whispered, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs. "That's not thunder." The rumble swelled into a deafening mechanical roar. It echoed off the gravestones, drowning out the sound of the rain and the wind. Thomas stepped away from the casket, his eyes glued to the wrought iron gates at the entrance of the cemetery, nearly a quarter-mile down the hill. Through the grey mist of the downpour, a single headlight cut through the gloom. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the crest of the hill was swarming with a massive motorized cavalry. Dozens, then seemingly hundreds of heavy, customized motorcycles poured onto the narrow asphalt road leading into Pine Ridge. They rode in a tight, disciplined formation, two abreast, their engines growling in a unified, terrifying symphony of raw power. Thomas watched in absolute shock as the procession wound its way through the cemetery. These weren't weekend riders or local enthusiasts. As they drew closer, the details snapped into sharp, intimidating focus. They rode chopped and raked Harley-Davidsons, stripped of anything unnecessary, gleaming with chrome and matte black paint. But it was the riders themselves that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. They were massive men, clad in heavy, waterlogged leather and soaked denim. Rain dripped from their bandanas and matted their long hair and thick beards. And on the back of every single leather cut, stitched in blood red and stark white, was the winged death's head. The Hells Angels. Thomas instinctively took a step back, bumping into the empty folding chairs. The Hells Angels were notorious. They were an outlaw motorcycle club, feared by law enforcement and civilians alike. What on earth were they doing here? Did they take a wrong turn? Were they looking for a different grave? The lead rider, a mountain of a man on a heavily modified black Harley, raised a single leather-gloved fist in the air. In perfect synchronization, the massive column of bikers slowed. They didn't turn around, they didn't pass by. They steered their heavy machines right off the asphalt, their thick tires sinking into the wet grass, forming a massive steel and leather horseshoe completely encircling Arthur Callahan's gravesite. For a terrifying moment, the roar of the engines was so loud, Thomas thought his eardrums would burst. The smell of high-octane exhaust fumes and wet leather overpowered the scent of damp earth. Then the leader dropped his fist, as over 100 ignition switches were killed. The sudden silence that fell over the cemetery was heavier and more profound than the roar had been. The only sound left was the hiss of rain, vaporizing against hundreds of boiling hot engine blocks. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Bill, the gravedigger, had scrambled up onto the seat of his backhoe, looking like he wanted to dig a hole and bury himself. Thomas stood frozen, his Bible clutched tightly to his chest, his umbrella slightly askew. The lead rider kicked out his kickstand and swung a massive booted leg over his bike. He was easily 6'4", built like a brick wall, with a tangled gray beard and a face deeply lined by wind, sun, and violence. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down into the collar of his shirt. On his chest, his patches identified him as a chapter president. He didn't look at Thomas. He didn't look at Bill. His dark, intense eyes were fixed entirely on the cheap pine casket and the American flag. The giant man walked forward, his heavy boots squelching in the mud. He bypassed the empty folding chairs, walking right up to the edge of the open grave. Behind him, the rest of the club began to dismount in total silence. Over 100 Hell's Angels, looking like an army of modern-day barbarians, stepped forward, forming a solid wall of leather and denim around the perimeter. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Excuse me, gentlemen," he squeaked, cursing his own trembling tone. He cleared his throat and tried again. I think there has been a mistake. This is a private service." The leader stopped. He slowly turned his massive head to look at Thomas. Up close, the man's eyes were bloodshot and filled with an emotion Thomas couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, it was sorrow. "There's no mistake, preacher," the man said. His voice was like grinding gravel, deep and resonant. He reached out a massive hand. "Jim Donovan. Everyone calls me Big Jim." Thomas hesitated, then tentatively shook the man's hand. Jim's grip was shockingly gentle. "I'm Reverend Miller," Thomas stammered. "But this is the funeral of Arthur Callahan." He didn't have any family. Big Jim looked back at the casket. The muscle in his jaw feathered as he clenched his teeth. He reached up and unzipped his heavy leather jacket, pulling it open. Beneath the jacket, he wore a plain black t-shirt. He grabbed the collar of the shirt and pulled it down slightly, exposing his left collarbone. There, faded by decades of sun and age, was a crude green ink tattoo. It was the insignia of the 1st Cavalry Division. "You're right about one thing, Reverend," Big Jim said softly, the rain plastering his gray hair to his forehead. "Arthur didn't have any family left. They all died, or they walked away. But you're wrong about the rest." Jim turned around, sweeping his arm out toward the 100 terrifying, silent men standing in the rain. "This man," Jim rumbled, his voice suddenly projecting over the entire cemetery, was Sergeant Artie Ghost Callahan. In February of 1968, in a patch of jungle that smelled like rotting meat and napalm, my squad was pinned down by a battalion of NVA regulars. We were dead men. We had no ammo, no radio, and no hope. Big Jim turned back to the casket, stepping closer. He reached out with a scarred hand and gently touched the wet fabric of the American flag. "Artie didn't retreat," Jim continued, his voice cracking slightly. "He laid down, suppressing fire. He took 2 rounds to the leg and 1 to the shoulder. He dragged me and 3 other boys out of a kill zone by his damn teeth. He bled for us. He gave up his peace of mind for us." Jim turned his intense gaze back to Thomas. The preacher was stunned. The crazy old hermit of Oakhaven was suddenly coming into sharp, heroic focus. "When we came home," Jim said, his tone turning bitter, "nobody spat on Artie because nobody even looked at him. The VA tossed him a handful of pills. The country forgot him, and the ghosts in his head chased him into the woods. He wouldn't take our money. He wouldn't let us help him, but he was our brother." A murmur of agreement rippled through the ranks of the bikers. Word went out on the wire 2 days ago that Ghost had finally found his peace, Jim said, his eyes scanning the incredibly sad, empty folding chairs. His lip curled in disgust. "We rode through the night from 3 different states. Because the Hells Angels don't let their own go into the dark alone." Jim looked at Thomas, nodding toward the open Bible. "So, preacher," Big Jim commanded, folding his massive arms across his chest. "You were reading the word. Don't stop on our account. Give our brother the send-off he earned." Reverend Thomas Miller looked at the weathered face of Big Jim, then out at the sea of leather, denim, and solemn faces. The fear that had gripped him just moments before evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy sense of awe. He looked down at his Bible, the damp pages suddenly feeling like they carried the weight of the entire world. I will," Thomas said, his voice finding a new, solid anchor. He stepped to the head of the grave. The 100 men of the Hells Angels moved in unison, taking off their soaking wet bandanas, helmets, and leather caps. They bowed their heads. The only sound was the relentless Ohio rain hitting the canopy of umbrellas and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 100 hardened men. "We commit the body of Arthur James Callahan to the ground," Thomas began, his voice ringing out with a startling clarity that cut through the storm. "Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. But today we do not just bury a man, we bury a warrior, a protector, a brother." Thomas looked directly at Big Jim. Arthur lived his life in the shadows, not because he was broken, but because he carried the burdens of others so they wouldn't have to. The Lord sees what is done in secret, and today that secret is brought into the light. Just as Thomas was preparing to read the final benediction, the wail of police sirens shattered the solemnity of the moment. Red and blue lights flashed frantically through the gray mist, reflecting off the chrome of the parked motorcycles. 2 Oakhaven County Sheriff's cruisers fishtailed onto the wet grass, tearing up the turf as they skidded to a halt just yards away from the perimeter of bikers. Sheriff Walt Harrison, a heavy-set man with a flushed face, burst out of his cruiser, his hand resting instinctively on the butt of his service weapon. Behind him, 2 younger deputies stepped out, looking terrified. "Hold it right there," Sheriff Harrison bellowed, marching toward the wall of bikers. "I don't know what kind of stunt you people are pulling, but this is an unpermitted gathering. The switchboard of the station is lighting up like a Christmas tree. You're terrifying half the town. Disperse immediately, or I'll start making arrests." The wall of Hell's Angels didn't flinch. They didn't even look at the sheriff. They kept their heads bowed, their eyes fixed on the casket. Big Jim slowly turned around. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator. He stepped out of the circle, closing the distance between himself and the sheriff. Walt Harrison stopped in his tracks, his bluster faltering as the giant biker loomed over him. "We are attending a funeral, Sheriff," Big Jim said, his voice dangerously low. "When the dirt is over, our brother, we will ride out. Not a second before. You don't dictate the law in my county," Harrison countered, though his voice cracked slightly. "Now get on those bikes and—" A sharp honk interrupted the standoff. A single father, Nan, entirely out of place in the muddy cemetery, aggressively pulled up behind the police cruisers. The passenger door swung open and out stepped Brenda, Arthur's niece. She was shielded from the rain by a large umbrella held by a slick-looking man in a tailored suit, Gregory Pierce, a high-priced probate attorney from the city. Brenda pointed a manicured finger at the bikers. "I knew it!" she shrieked, her voice carrying over the rain. "I knew that crazy old fool was hiding something." Thomas stepped forward, appalled. "Brenda? What on earth are you doing here? I'm here to stop this burial," Brenda declared, marching forward with her lawyer in tow. Sheriff Harrison looked bewildered by the sudden intrusion. "My uncle lived like a rat for 40 years. I thought he was just a pathetic broke loser. But when I heard a biker gang was swarming his grave, it all made sense." She turned to Sheriff Harrison. "Arrest them, officer. They're here to dig up whatever illicit stash of drug money or gold he hid in that coffin. I'm his only living blood relative, and whatever he was hiding belongs to me." A low, dangerous rumble rippled through the ranks of the bikers. Hands tightened into fists. Leather creaked. Big Jim raised a single hand, and the murmurs instantly died. He looked at Brenda with a mixture of profound pity and utter disgust. "You think Artie was hiding money?" Big Jim asked, his voice echoing in the damp air. "You think a man who took 3 bullets for his country was running drugs for us? Why else would you criminals be here?" The lawyer Pierce sneered, stepping out from beneath the umbrella. "We have a court order pending to seize all assets." "Step aside." Big Jim didn't move. Instead, he snapped his fingers. A younger biker, heavily tattooed with a scarred face, stepped forward. He was carrying a large olive-drab military canvas duffel bag. It looked ancient, stained with grease and time. He set it down gently in the mud at Big Jim's feet. "Your uncle didn't have a dime to his name, lady," Big Jim said. He knelt in the mud, uncaring about his jeans, and unbuckled the heavy canvas straps. He lived in a rusted metal can. He ate cheap beans. He didn't have heat in the winter. Jim pulled open the flaps of the duffel bag. "But he had a pension, and he had a disability check," Jim continued. He reached into the bag and pulled out a handful of items. They weren't stacks of $100 bills. They weren't bricks of contraband. They were envelopes, hundreds and hundreds of tightly banded yellowing envelopes, alongside stacks of meticulously kept ledger books and faded postal receipts. Big Jim stood up, holding a stack of envelopes out toward Brenda. She hesitated, then snatched one away. "What is this?" she demanded, tearing it open. Inside was a handwritten letter and a copy of a money order. "For 42 years, Big Jim said, his voice suddenly thick with emotion, Sergeant Arthur Callahan tracked down the widows, the children and the grandchildren of every single man who died in our platoon. Men who died under his command, men he couldn't save. The silence in the cemetery was absolute, save for the patter of the rain." Sheriff Harrison lowered his hand from his gun. Thomas felt his breath hitch in his chest. "Every month," Jim said, "Artie cashed his government checks. He kept exactly enough to buy his beans and his coffee, and he sent every single remaining cent to the families of the fallen. He paid for college tuitions anonymously. He paid for hospital bills. He bought Christmas presents for kids who never got to meet their grandfathers." Jim took a step closer to Brenda, who was staring at the letter in her hands, her face draining of color. "You carried the guilt of surviving," Jim whispered fiercely. "He gave away his entire life to make sure the families of his brothers didn't suffer. That duffel bag, that's his legacy. Those are the return letters. Thousands of thank yous from people who never knew his real name, only that an angel in Ohio was looking out for them." The lawyer, Pierce, awkwardly cleared his throat and took a step back, suddenly very interested in the mud on his expensive shoes. Brenda's hands began to shake. The letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the wet grass. The ugly, greedy facade she had worn shattered, replaced by a sudden, crushing realization of her own profound selfishness. She looked at the cheap pine box, then at the 100 hardened men who had ridden through a storm to honor the man she had called a lunatic. She didn't say a word. She turned around, abandoning her lawyer's umbrella, and walked slowly back to the Mercedes, letting the rain wash over her. Sheriff Walt Harrison slowly took off his wide-brimmed Stetson, letting the rain soak his thinning hair. He looked at Big Jim, his eyes reflecting a deep, humbling shame. I apologize, Mr. Friss. Donovan, Sheriff Harrison said quietly. He turned to his deputies. Get back in the cruisers. Kill the lights. We're going to stand guard at the gate until the service is over. Nobody disturbs this funeral. Thank you, Sheriff. Big Jim nodded respectfully. With the disruption handled, Big Jim turned back to the gray. He looked at Reverend Thomas. Finish it, preacher. Bring him home. Thomas wiped a mixture of rain and tears from his face. He didn't look at his Bible. He didn't need to. He looked down at the flag-draped coffin, finally understanding the true magnitude of the man resting inside it. Arthur Callahan, Thomas said, his voice echoing with absolute conviction. You have fought the good fight. You have finished the race. You have kept the faith. You gave everything you had to this world, in silence and in honor. May flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. Amen. 100 rough voices rumbled in unison. Bill, the gravedigger, who had been watching the entire ordeal with wide eyes, quietly engaged the gears of the lowering device. The thick canvas straps whirred, and the cheap pine box slowly descended into the earth. As the casket hit the bottom of the grave, Big Jim stepped forward. He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a beautifully polished silver Zippo lighter. It was engraved with the 1st Cavalry insignia. He pressed it to his lips, closed his eyes for a brief second, and tossed it down into the grave. One by one, the other Hell's Angels stepped forward. They didn't throw flowers. They threw pieces of themselves. A military challenge coin, a frayed leather bracelet, a faded photograph. Small, silent tokens of a brotherhood forged in fire and blood. When the last man had paid his respects, Big Jim turned to the club. He didn't shout an order. He simply gave a sharp 2-finger whistle. Instantly, the men turned and marched back to their motorcycles. They swung their heavy legs over the saddles. Preacher, Big Jim said, lingering for a moment. He reached out and gripped Thomas's shoulder. His hand was heavy, grounding, and incredibly warm. Thank you for not leaving him alone. I never will again, Thomas promised, his voice choked with emotion. Big Jim offered a slow, solemn nod. He walked over to his massive black Harley and kicked up the stand. He turned the ignition switch. Fire 'em up. Jim roared. The cemetery exploded into a deafening mechanical symphony. Over 100 heavy V-twin engines roared to life simultaneously, shaking the ground, the gravestones, and the very air in Thomas's lungs. It wasn't just noise. It was a 21-engine salute. For 60 seconds, the Hells Angels held their throttles wide open. The roar was a battle cry, a wail of grief, and a triumphant herald all at once. It was the loudest, most glorious sound Thomas had ever heard. It echoed over the hills, rolling down into the town of Oakhaven, a sound that the town would remember for generations. Then, exactly as coordinated as their arrival, the engines throttled down. Big Jim dropped his bike into gear with a heavy clunk. He led the column out, the massive tires churning the mud, leaving deep, permanent scars in the earth. Thomas and Bill stood in the silence of the aftermath, watching the long line of red tail lights disappear into the gray mist. The rain finally began to slow, reducing to a soft, quiet drizzle. A single ray of afternoon sunlight broke through the heavy cloud cover, illuminating the mound of fresh earth and the canvas duffel bag sitting beside it. Arthur Callahan had lived his life as a ghost, ignored and forgotten by the world around him. But as Thomas looked at the deep tire tracks permanently etched into the cemetery grass, he knew the truth. The ghost had summoned an army, and in the end Arthur Callahan was the richest man in the cemetery. If Arthur's incredible sacrifice and the unbreakable brotherhood of these bikers touched your heart, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true heroes often live in the shadows. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another real-life story of honor, loyalty, and redemption. Leave a comment below with your thoughts.